So welcome to this webinar about the evolving landscape for cookies and tracking. If you're interested to listen in, you're probably wondering how the phase out of the third-party cookie in Google Chrome and device identifiers in the Android will change things for your organization or even for your role as a data protection expert or a legal expert. We don't have these answers, but what we're going to try to do today is give you some intuition, some background that will help you apply first principles to whatever changes that will come your way. So we've structured this webinar in 3 parts. First, we're going back to the origin of the cookie, because that history informs a lot of the changes that we're seeing today. Second, we'll go to the processing of cookies and tracking in the context of GDPR and e-privacy and look at the interplay between them. And finally, we'll actually try to figure out what organizations are going to do to adapt to the phase out of the third-party cookie. So who are we? I'm Thomas. I'm a privacy engineer. I try to bridge the gap between data strategy, data protection, and do a lot of work on data protection impact assessments. I'm also the founder and CEO of a platform called Webclew, and Webclew tries to automate privacy audits for websites and apps.
And I'm Anouk Fouquet. I'm a lawyer at the Brussels-based law firm Faros. We specialize exactly in this field, and we have plenty of first-hand experience also with how data protection authorities look into this matter.
Okay, so where do we start? Let's go back to how the internet works. When I enter a URL in my browser, the ISP will look up the IP address of that URL and then call a server to basically return a page. And as that page renders in my browser, there will be other requests to the same server, to other servers that ultimately make up the page. Now that principle still applies today, even though there's so much infrastructure built on top of the web. But in the very early days, this was still a bit of a crude experience. So if I would go to an e-commerce site and put things in my basket, I'd better immediately purchase that item, because if I would go to another page, that item was not stored. And the reason is that the foundation of the Internet Protocol, the HTTP request, is stateless. And by that we mean that there's no memory. For efficiency reasons, the server is really instructed to handle your request, process it, and then forget about you. So there is nothing built into a browser or the server that actually allowed you to have some kind of memory. And so one summer, in the early days of the internet, there was an engineer called Lou Montulli who was working in Netscape, and he was tasked to come up with an idea to basically solve for this memory problem. And so his idea came back from old code books where there was this notion of a super cookie, which is where the name cookie actually comes from. And he figured out this way by taking a small text file and using that text file in addition to the request to basically tell the server something. And the very first concept was a user identity for a shop, for an online shop, where the user identity allowed the server to then basically be able to say, oh, this and this and this item actually belongs to the same person. And this is how really the first cookie and the first type of memory came about. And so what you really have to remember about cookies, they're just small files of text stored in your browser, and it's a request that's kind of taking care of sending back information back and forth, and this is how some information can persist in your browser. And although again there's many more fancy things we do these days, that principle still very much holds. So it's also interesting to maybe understand a bit more about how cookies and tracking or requests, what they actually look like. And you can one way is just to open your browser and go to the inspector window, and there you'll see the cookies right there. But that's not necessarily a very user-friendly interface. So we'd like to maybe share an analogy, right? You can think of a cookie jar where, if you're somewhat tidy, you've labeled that jar, for example, with chocolate chip cookies, and in there are the actual value, what you care about, which are the cookies themselves. And the label on top of the jar also has an expiration date after which you throw away these cookies. And these pieces of metadata are really the most important information that is stored in a cookie. There's some other stuff, but really it's all about just having a name, a value, and then an expiration after which the cookie is automatically deleted. Sticking to an analogy, we can also look at a request and think of it as an order. So you want to know where you are ordering from, so that could be the domain name in the request. Then there are, there's the actual order. Do you want a drink or not? How large do you want your burger to be, and so on. And this type of information is typically stored in a query string that is included in the request. There's also headers, which you typically don't see in your browser, but they're very much there. And they typically contain all this kind of accessory information about limitations or, for example, about language that are helpful to process the order. And then finally, what comes back is the actual content, which in this example is a burger of questionable quality. But so again, there's much more metadata that is involved, but really URLs are just sending, again, pieces of information into to a specific destination designated by the URL. And so, all good so far. But in the very early days, Lou immediately already realized that there might be privacy concerns. Because what if someone could kind of snoop away this specific file and get access to your identity? So they put in a very important foundational limitation to cookies, namely only the server that writes or puts the cookie there is the one that can access it. So there is a separation by domain. And this is where the distinction between the first and the third-party cookie came about. And that's really also the only distinction, just the server that calls them. Now, that really didn't last long, because it didn't take a long time before a few smart guys figured out a way around this. And the way around is basically if you have one server or one domain that's connected to a lot of different websites, then that one domain or server can follow these people around. And the people that figured that out were the founders of DoubleClick, which was later acquired by Google and is still with DoubleClick.net or DoubleClick.com one of the most widely trafficked domains on the internet. It's the origin of advertising as we know it, an industry that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars today, and it really came down to this simple hack. If we are able to have one domain that connects all of the other domains, then we can glean a lot of information from users and basically personalize advertising, serve advertisements smartly. And obviously, at the time, people at Netscape were thinking about, do we fight back or do we allow for this? And ultimately, they realized that it was going to be a cat and a mouse game, and so they allowed for this type of tracking to happen. And I think Lou, in the quote below, put it very precisely. It's not the type of vulnerability where someone can just kind of steal information that is stored in a cookie from you. That's actually very hard. But the privacy invasiveness really comes from this kind of corporate tracking, where if you incentivize a lot of different website and app owners to all call your specific domain, then you can really gather a ton of information about people around the entire internet. And this is really the origin of advertising, but also the origin of tracking and privacy concerns related to it.
Thanks, Thomas. I think it is crucial to have at least a basic knowledge of how cookies and other tracking means work in practice to be able to correctly implement the legal obligations that we have in this regard. So let's jump right into that. The legal framework for cookies and other tracking means consists first and foremost of Directive 2002/58/EC, also called the e-privacy directive. Now, the e-privacy directive complements and particularizes the GDPR when it comes to processing in the electronic communications sector. It's what we call the lex specialis. Its provisions prevail over the more general provisions of the GDPR. Now, normally speaking, under the GDPR, the processing of personal data can be justified on the basis of all lawful grounds mentioned in Article 6 of the GDPR. However, when it comes to processing of personal data in the context of cookies or other tracking means, this full range does not apply because the e-privacy directive explicitly provides, as a rule, that consent is required for the storing or gaining access to information already stored in a user's device. So, to the extent that the information involved constitutes personal data, Article 5.3 of the e-privacy directive shall take precedence over Article 6 of the GDPR with regards to the activity of storing and accessing information in the user's device. Any type of processing subsequent to such storing and accessing of information, to the extent that personal data is involved, will not be covered by the e-privacy directive, but will still fall under the GDPR. As I mentioned, the e-privacy directive also complements the GDPR. In this regard, it's worthy to note that even if no personal data is involved, and so the GDPR is not applicable, the e-privacy directive will still apply. That being said, of course, cookies and other tracking means often involve personal data, and so GDPR will nevertheless be applicable. Now, let's dive right into the consent requirements for cookies. As I just mentioned, the e-privacy directive prohibits the placement of cookies prior to obtaining consent from the user. Now, there is an important exception to this rule, which of course needs to be interpreted strictly, namely for technically necessary cookies and functional cookies. Let's take a look at these two categories of cookies. The first category you can see at the top of this slide are cookies that are technically necessary for the transmission of the communication over the electronic communications network. And they are necessary for the good operation of the website, for example, for establishing the connection with the server. Load balancing cookies are also a good example of these technically necessary cookies, which do not require consent. A second category of cookies that is exempted from the consent requirement are so-called user service or functional cookies. They serve essential functionalities of the website or the app, as well as functionalities that have been explicitly requested by the user. Think of cookies necessary for remembering a login, items in a shopping basket, language preferences, and so forth. Also, cookies that are necessary to remember the cookie preferences of a user are generally considered as functional cookies and thus are therefore exempt from the consent requirement. Please remember, the data protection authorities do recommend only keeping such cookies for a limited period of time. For example, the French Data Protection Authority as well as the Belgian Data Protection Authority find a 6 months retention period for such cookies to be reasonable. Now, it's just a recommendation. We're not telling you to change all of your retention periods to 6 months. For example, we still don't have a position of the European Court of Justice in this respect. But keep in mind, persistent cookies are most likely not functional cookies. So these two categories of cookies do not require consent. All other categories of cookies do require consent. And let's have a look at them one by one. First category of cookies that will require consent from the user are analytical or statistical cookies, however you want to call them. These cookies allow tracking the user's browsing path to and on your website. And so they are used for improving the website's operations, but also for measuring, for example, the effectiveness of search engine hits and advertisements. Please remember, even first-party analytical cookies require consent in most jurisdictions. We all know that there is a proposal for a new e-privacy regulation which allows for the placement of first-party analytical cookies without prior consent. However, this regulation has not been adopted yet, and perhaps it will never be adopted. So the rule to remember is that in most jurisdictions, even these first-party analytical cookies require consent. Next, we have a series of categories of cookies that are typically classified as marketing or advertisement cookies. Now, not only for legal purposes, and I will come back to this in a second, but also for informational purposes, it is useful to divide these categories of cookies into subcategories. with the first subcategory being cookies that allow you to personalize the content on a website or app. For example, personalized search results, personalized news articles fall within this category. A second category is then your typical cookie that is used to personalize advertisements of the website operator's own products and services. And a third subcategory are the cookies that allow the personalization of advertisement for partners of the website owner. And then a final subcategory are then your so-called retargeting cookies. This will allow you to personalize advertisements on other platforms than your own website. So last but not least, you have your social media cookies. For example, the Like plugin from Facebook. These cookies serve multiple purposes, going from allowing you to embed social media functionalities into the content of your website to tracking of members and non-members of the social network, for example, to display advertisements.
Yeah. And that's the other challenge here, Anouk. It's very hard to be aware as a website owner or an app owner exactly what's happening, because they're typically embedded as a iframe, a website in a website, or as an SDK. So it's actually also rather being safe than sorry, and really making sure that you ask consent for that entire category of functionalities that's going to be included in your domain.
Yeah, we've noticed that as well in our practice. So with this, you have the full overview of cookie categories, cookie purposes that we typically see today. It's important to keep this in mind when you apply the legal obligations in practice. One more point that I want to make in this regard is going back to the distinction that Thomas made between first-party and third-party cookies. As a rule of thumb, be aware that third-party cookies are generally considered not to be necessary for the technical operation or functionalities of the website, and therefore will typically require consent. This may not always be the case, but in cases where you would not obtain consent for placement of third-party cookies, make sure that you have convincing explanation, because you have the odds against you, so to say. All of this will not surprise you that accurate classification of cookies is crucial. As soon as you incorrectly qualify a cookie as a necessary cookie, and therefore it is placed without the prior consent from the user, you will have an immediate violation of e-privacy legislation. So that was it for the scope of the purposes and the consent requirement for cookies. Now, how do you obtain lawful consent? Well, consent must comply with the requirements of the GDPR. So this means that consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Let's take a look at these 4 requirements using a common cookie banner design that we have here on the website. First requirement is that consent needs to be unambiguous. This means that a cookie banner cannot use pre-ticked checkboxes for obtaining consent. The previously accepted practice whereby consent would be obtained through active use of the website or just closing the cookie banner or any other form of inactivity is in principle no longer valid. A cookie consent really requires a clear affirmative action from the user, for example by clicking a button or ticking a checkbox. Now, some jurisdictions leave some room for obtaining consent through further browsing of the website under strict conditions. And of course, we're happy to brainstorm with you about how you can implement this in practice, but just be aware that this is not a common practice anymore. Today, it will always be in the gray zone and therefore not giving you legal certainty as to whether consent has been obtained lawfully. A second requirement is that consent must be specific. This requirement entails that the user can give consent for each of the different cookie purposes separately. And that must be done at least in the second layer of the cookie banner. As you can see here, the different purposes are mentioned. So just an allow all or reject all through the entire cookie banner is not acceptable. To give you some additional examples, the Belgian Data Protection Authority finds that cookies that are used for personalizing your own advertisements serve a different purpose from cookies that are used for personalizing the advertisements of partners. So those 2 types of cookies will require separate consent. Similarly, with regards to social media cookies, that you can use for liking, sharing, or following on social media networks, those are different cookies, serve a different purpose than cookies that are used for advertising on social media networks. And a final rule of thumb in this respect is that it is also recommended that you give the option to reject or accept cookie purposes per partner, again in a second or subsequent layer of the cookie banner. This being said, it will not surprise you that data protection authorities discourage the use of cookies for multiple purposes. That being said, we all know that this is not always technically possible. I think we all know a very well-known third-party cookie that on the one hand allows you to remember cookie preferences of the user, but also seems to allow online tracking. What you need to remember in this respect is what the former Working Party 29 has stated, and that is, while you would be exempted from asking consent for remembering the cookie preferences, because this cookie would also track online activity, you will nevertheless need to obtain consent for this type of cookie. Third requirement is that consent must be informed. Under the GDPR, information is required. What information do you need to include in the first layer of your cookie banner? Well, first and foremost, the different purposes for which you request the user's consent. Secondly, your identity and the identity of any other entity responsible for placing or reading the cookies. Thirdly, you will also need to provide information on how the user can accept or reject cookies and what the consequences are. And finally, you will also need to inform the user of his or her right to withdraw their consent at any time and how they can withdraw such consent. The final cumulative condition is that consent must be freely given. In this regard, there is still considerable debate about the use of contrasting colors for the accept and reject buttons, as well as any other ways that push the user into giving consent for cookies. So the last word has not been said with regards to that. So these were the 4 cumulative conditions for obtaining lawful consent. Before we end this part, 2 final remarks in this regard. Revoking or withdrawing consent must be as easy as giving consent. For example, you can include a link or a button on every page of your website linking to your cookie banner, where the user can then, with one click of a button, like you see here, withdraw their consent for cookies that have been placed. Second remark, these are the consent requirements. You also have a general transparency obligation under the GDPR, which means that you will also need to provide further information on the cookies that you use on your website, either further down the line in your browser, in your cookie banner rather, or in your cookie notice or privacy notice. What you include is the name of the cookies that you use, the purpose that they serve, whether they're first or third-party cookies, and the retention period. So this is the cookie banner that we're of course most familiar with, but we need to say something about what we see emerging more and more today, which are cookie walls and paywalls, Thomas.
Yeah, indeed. Because as you mentioned, the reject all button is really the most contentious requirement. And the main reason is because it hurts if you're then the domain owner. Because indeed, when you add reject all to the first layer of your banner, a lot of people will click on it. And so in response, many organizations, mainly publishers for example, have been starting to think, can we offer an alternative to the reject all, which is a subscription? Now it's very important to distinguish a cookie paywall from the traditional cookie walls, which have been very popular, for example, in the Netherlands for quite some time. And the traditional cookie wall was really saying, unless you consent to all of these different purposes, you're not getting in. And that's obviously not a free choice, and I think that's now pretty clearly established, as you mentioned. But the cookie paywall is actually saying you can get access to the site by either paying through the exposure to personalized advertising, or by paying a subscription fee. So in this setting, you're really creating an alternative for the reject all, and increasingly we're seeing more lenience or more viability for that approach from different data protection authorities and the European Court of Justice.
So you have the prohibited cookie walls, which mean all or nothing,
Yeah.
versus the more and more acceptable paywalls, where you have two options, a paid option and a free option where you need to consent or where you are free to consent to cookies for advertising purposes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you look at the requirements for this model, they will look quite similar to what you just mentioned, right? Where the first and second layer will typically be quite similar. Now, the important note that we make here is that you'll see today other cookie paywalls appear where you're actually seeing less of a choice, especially at the second layer for other purposes. I think it's still a bit of a, there's still a lot of debate around it, but if you look at the different guidelines from data protection authorities and decisions on this, they really distinguish the scope of personalized advertising, which may include profiling, targeting, measurement, from all the other purposes. So in their view, you can't just bundle consent for content recommendations, for analytics, for social media with that personalized advertising choice.
Yeah.
So it's really a choice between paying with ads or subscribing to be free from looking at these ads, but all the other choices still would require a separate consent to be specific.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so on the last note on this, obviously Meta has been in the news 2 times at least this year in the data protection space because they were trying or experimenting with other legal bases such as contract and performance of a contract and legitimate interest for serving behavioral advertising. The cookie paywall is very different from the performance of a contract. The subscription is an alternative to the consent opt-out for behavioral advertising, but that does not mean that you're entering into performance of a contract in this model for advertising. Yeah. All right, so let's take this back to the world of cookies and tracking and how they will now evolve in response to the demise of the third-party cookie. As we mentioned in the beginning, it's really that neat trick of the third-party cookie connecting different domains that basically fueled a lot of the use cases that typically require consent, but have been very popular, such as profiling, getting interests from different users, targeting them, measuring their responses to content and ads. And so all of these, they can still work in the first-party only world. Problem is, they're much less interesting because all of them will be isolated. So it's much less insightful that you are going to gather some insights from a single domain when you typically have maybe 50 or 60. So how is the industry in general going to adapt? And I'm going to focus on advertising for now because this is really where the action is happening. It's the browser war and the changes that Google is making that's really informing how the rest of the internet will somehow have to adapt as well. Talking about publishers, who are basically the companies selling advertising inventory, and advertisers, who's any company that's trying to target an audience online. So you have 2 options. You can either try to avoid using an identifier that you used to have, or you can look for an alternative. On the left, contextual is as old as time, if you remember print advertising. So here we're just looking at the context of the page rather than the individual that's on it. It's a technique that is gained traction, not just because of the announcement by Google, but also because the advancements in natural language processing that have made contextual targeting better. But it's definitely not a silver bullet. Contextual works well in places where you have niche content or, for example, a classified site with clear intents, but it works less well when you have general purpose news, for example. What Google is now focusing on as an alternative is trying to say, can we level up to a group of individuals that share certain traits, certain interests, and actually target the level of the group without giving away the identities of the people that belong to that group. And we'll go into that in the next slide with a bit more detail. On the right here, we can replace the ID. First, we still have first party, right? That will still work, that will not change. And so what you see as one strategy is rather than doing a client to third-party server connection, you'll see some technology moving from a client to first-party server to third-party server approach. But I think the most interesting, or at least the most viable alternative, will be a persistent identifier. Hey, this is email, right? So we're going back to a characteristic that we know about the user that can be consistent across these different pages on a browser, but also perhaps across the browser and the device. So alternatives could be an account login, etc. But it just has to be something that sticks to that individual, that allows you to recognize the same person. Typically, these persistent identifiers will be hashed. And that has two main benefits. So first, we have a pseudonymous identifier, which we always prefer, but also you can nicely segregate the different purposes for which you want to use an identifier. So you can take that email and then hash it in a certain way to get a internal analytical tracker, or sorry, an identity for analytical tracking, or you can also then make a separate ID that you will share with an ad tech company. And the last thing is device fingerprinting. Just to give you some intuition about this approach, if I want to describe Anouk, I could say how long her hair is, or that she has black shoes, and so on, and ultimately come up with so many descriptions that I get a kind of a unique description of Anouk. And device fingerprinting works in exactly that same way. So the recipient of requests and browser context will look at the IP address, will look at the screen size, but also, for example, the number of fonts that are installed, as much detail as they can gather to create a unique fingerprint. And we call this creepy from a data protection point of view, because even if you would ask consent for such an approach, you're still using an approach that is much less controllable than a cookie for the data subject, but also goes against the data minimization principle and proportionality principle, especially because there are alternatives to this approach. So we don't recommend it. Giving you a few examples of technologies that you may already have been in touch with, or that you may be seeing going in your direction. So first, cohort-based, Google with the Privacy Sandbox is really leaning on this approach to come up with alternative APIs for the third-party cookie-supported use cases that they were facilitating before. I'm just listing a few examples because there's many more, but topics will be the replacement of typical profiling use cases, where rather than every publisher or the advertiser kind of building their own profiles, the browser is actually gathering interest or aggregating interests from all of these visits that a user does in their browser, assigning these URLs to specific topics. And then when an advertiser wants to buy an ad impression from a specific website the user is on, they will get a list of typically up to 5 topics for targeting. But these topics have privacy guarantees baked into them, and there's no longer a one-to-one exchange of data between the publisher and the advertiser. The protected audience API tries to use similar tricks to replace remarketing. So there again, the fact that you might be visiting an e-commerce site that has that has certain merchandise that the advertiser also wants to advertise to you, rather than having all of that information stored at the individual level, this will now be aggregated to a kind of an interest topic, and the advertiser will be able to then later retarget based on that interest topic, but no longer knows exactly who that individual is. And finally, the attribution reporting API from Google is trying to find an alternative for measurement, where it's trying to add, again, much less of individual-based information, but rather using these click events and adding coarse information to them to get privacy-preserving guarantees to the publishers and advertisers that would consume these kind of data. Important to note, obviously, is that here there's always still an aggregator. There's a place where individual interests, transactions are being recorded and being processed. So it's not that consent is going to be eliminated, but the number of parties that get access to individual data is strongly reduced with the cohort-based approach. And then looking on the right, you'll typically see a combination of that persistent identifier that is then stored in a first-party context. And the first application is a publisher-provided ID, where typically, for example, a publisher would just say, hey, this is my email, my hashed email, and I'm going to use this to connect the dots within my own network of websites and apps. A second approach is the Universal Matching API, where a party will go sit in the middle between publishers, advertisers, their ad tech vendors, and basically allow them to compare these emails. So they do this both in a pseudonymous and an encrypted way that typically gives you additional privacy guarantees, and they'll basically make sure that whenever two parties have the same ID, that they can match the same ID, but they're not sharing much more information than that. So it's just sufficient to basically create addressability, to know this user is on my site and that's also the same user that may have been visiting your site, but you're not necessarily creating shared identities or anything else. You're just being able to compare specific persistent identifiers across multiple parties. And then you have the last approach, which we would call a universal identity graph. And here there's also a party sitting in the middle, but this party is really orchestrating identities across a network of parties. So whenever a user would visit a publisher or an advertiser domain, if that user is not known, a new ID is assigned, and if the user is recognized, the same ID is returned. So you're creating a consistent ID across all of the parties that use that universal ID graph. The last two, they both contain the word universal, and you might read, if you would read up on it, you'll typically see that both are called universal IDs. But I do really want to highlight that the last category is very different from the Universal Matching API, and there's two concerns that we typically see from a data protection point of view regarding the ID graphs. So first, it might be that all of the parties that are contributing to the shared identity are considered joint controllers, and that also means that they're jointly liable for whatever's happening down the chain. The second thing is that these technologies do also tend to rely on device fingerprinting, which we just discussed, and are therefore, also, I think, much more risky than the other two approaches. So that was just to give you a little bit of intuition on some of the approaches that companies are going to apply to adapt to a first-party only environment.
So Thomas, I understand that technologies are changing, but what is important is that as soon as you store information or gain access to information in a user's device, GDPR and e-privacy will apply. That does not change. So the conclusions that we take from this are twofold. From my legal perspective, Thomas, what I need to do is translate the information that people like you give us, make sure that we understand what is the input, what is the output, what is the impact of these alternative technologies, and take it from there to then apply the legal framework.
Yeah, indeed, and it's typically after that translation that a lot of things suddenly become clear, that publisher-provided ad identifier is then just a hashed email sent to Google, and then the same principles will mostly apply. I think my conclusion would also be that beware of business owners or vendors trying to sway you with a cookieless alternative that seemingly puts you out of the context of your privacy or GDPR for the reasons you just mentioned. I think cookieless tracking is an oxymoron, and typically there will still be some form of consent somewhere in the chain. It does not mean that every party that relies on the use case will need to ask consent. That really needs to be looked at in detail, but typically you can't have kind of individual targeting or measurement without any form of consent. So on a final note, trackers will eat any form of storage, not just cookies. And even though we've talked a lot about cookies in this presentation, what really matters is the ultimate tracking, the combination of storage and requests being sent around from a data protection point of view. And so, again, you really just have to rely on all of the instincts that you already have regarding e-privacy and GDPR. And when the context is clear enough, typically you will be able to navigate all of these new use cases.
Okay, thanks. If you've made it this far, we very much appreciate it. If there's anything useful that you take with you, we would love to hear back from you. Also, if you have questions or suggestions for the future, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Bye.